Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to the first episode of the FroFrame Film Guide to make you a better filmmaker. Now today, we'll be talking about the exposure triangle and how it can affect your image to take your video from looking like this to looking like this. If you've used a camera before or taken any photojournalism class, then you may be familiar with terms like shutter speed, aperture, or ISO. These are the three camera settings that control how exposed your image is to light. Now the first vertex of our exposure triangle is shutter speed. This controls how long your sensor is exposed to light. The slower your shutter speed, the more light you let into your sensor, and a super fast shutter speed will close off that connection very quickly, leaving you with a very dark image. Next up is aperture. Unlike ISO or shutter speed, the range of this setting lies solely in your lens and not your camera body. Aperture controls how wide the opening of your lens is, and a super wide opening will let in a lot of light, and vice versa. Now, the magnitude of your aperture is determined by the mathematical equation f-stop equals your focal length over the diameter of the opening of your lens. The lower the number of your f-stop, the wider the opening of your lens will be. For example, a lens at f over 2.8 will let in twice as much light as a lens set at f over 4. Lastly, we have our ISO. Put simply, this setting controls how sensitive your camera sensor is to light. A low ISO produces less light and vice versa. If you're filming outdoors on a sunny day, you'll probably want to set your ISO to 100 or whatever your base or native ISO for your camera is. When shooting indoors, you may want to bump up your ISO a little to maybe 800 or 3200 depending on how the lighting is. Now, this may sound like you can just generate light out of nowhere, but there's a drawback to jacking up your ISO. In fact, every one of these settings has an effect on your image outside of just changing the amount of light let in. Let me explain. Shutter speed is the main factor that affects motion blur. As you increase your shutter speed, you decrease motion blur. Inversely, if you decrease your shutter speed, the amount of motion blur in your image will increase. When it comes down to motion blur in film, there's a general rule where you want your shutter speed to be double what your frame rate is. If you're shooting at 24 FPS, you'll want your shutter speed to look more like 1/50th of a second, or if you're shooting at 30 FPS, 1/60th of a second. Or if you're shooting slow motion at 120 FPS, you'll want to jack up your shutter speed to 1/250. Now, aperture controls how much of your shot is in focus. Now, when your subject is in focus and the background is super blurry, we call the difference in focus our depth of field. Not only will a low aperture brighten our image, but it will also produce a shallow depth of field and give you that nice blurry, creamy background we call bokeh or bokeh or however you want to say that. Finally, ISO controls how clear your video is. While a high ISO is nice when you don't have enough light in your scene, increasing it will introduce noise and grain. Now, the amount of grain you get at certain values of ISO depends on the quality of your camera. Grain isn't always something to run away from. If you embrace the grain, you can use it as a stylistic choice to enhance the story of what you're trying to convey in your film. Thank you all for staying to the end, and make sure you leave a like and subscribe if you want to stay up to date with all of my future film and photography guides. See ya!